So as I said, Tuesday's a long day. It's actually the longest day of the week, according to Mark. Mark's account of the week, and we're starting this. Where? Let me look. Tuesday begins in chapter 11, verse 20. We're told, in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. So that begins at Mark 11, verse 20. And Tuesday is going to carry us all the way to chapter 14. So it's a pretty lengthy section, right? And the majority of it will be focused in the temple again. We're coming back to the temple that Jesus just threw everything around in the day before, right? So now we're going to come back to the temple. This is going to take us through the end of chapter 13. Chapter 14 will start Wednesday. And so we know about the fig tree. So let me read the rest of this passage. In the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God." All right, I may have to shut my windows because I don't know what you're hearing over my thing, but it's loud here.
Are we reading Genesis?
No. It's actually raining in the windows now. All right, so maybe that will help. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses." And here's what Borg and Crossan say about Tuesday. Tuesday is a busy day, a full day. Mark's narrative of the day's events cover almost 3 chapters, a total of 115 verses. The next longest days are Thursday at 60 verses and Friday at 47 verses. Tuesday is thus the longest day in Mark's story of Jesus' final week. About 2/3 of Tuesday consists of conflict with temple authorities and their associates. And then the remaining third, which is chapter 13, warns of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and speaks of the coming of the Son of Man, all in the near future. So Jesus, they are returning, remember, from Bethany. Bethany is where they've gone to spend the night. They did that Sunday night, come back Monday. Monday night, they go back to Bethany. They come back in. That's when they see the fig tree. And go immediately to the temple and spend most of the day in the temple. Then they will move at the end, and we'll get to this at the end of Tuesday, but he'll move, finally comes out of the temple, moves to the Mount of Olives. And then presumably they're headed back to Bethany, but we're not told that. But that's probably where they're going, to camp out at their friend's house where they're staying, which again is probably Mary, Martha, and Lazarus' house. So I want to continue this part in Borg and Crossan. The day begins with a flashback to Monday by closing the frame of the fig tree around the temple incident. Tuesday morning, as Jesus and his followers return to Jerusalem from nearby Bethany, where they had spent the night, they see the fig tree withered away to its roots. The fig tree symbolizes Jerusalem and the temple. Mark just juxtaposes the withered fig tree with a saying about this mountain, that is, Mount Zion, on which the temple stood, being thrown into the sea. In closing, as in opening, the fig tree frames and reflects on Jesus' deed and word in the temple. As Tuesday continues, Jesus and his followers arrive in Jerusalem and enter the temple, not meaning the sanctuary itself, which was quite small, but the large open-air courts and porticos of the temple platform. This area was often the scene of teaching, and during Passover week, it was thronged with pilgrims. All of Mark, from 1125 through 1244, happens in this very public setting. The authorities and their associates challenged Jesus with a series of questions intended to entrap and discredit him in the presence of the crowd. Jesus responds in an equally challenging way, sometimes turning the questions back upon them, sometimes directly indicting them. To use technical scholarly language, these are challenge and riposte stories. That's what that's the vision I want you to take to bed with you, that challenge and riposte. To remember that, because I probably won't remember that when I get up in the morning, but that's what's going on. It's the banter that goes back and forth between Jesus and the authorities, right? And we get a lot of them. And I don't know if you've read ahead for this section of Mark's gospel. And what's interesting is these are stories that we've been hearing in this lectionary cycle, aren't they?
Yes.
So we've heard them already on some of the Sundays, and now, and so out of context, it may not mean as much to us, although we can talk about what the stories represent. But when you put it in the context that this is Tuesday of Christ's last week, then suddenly it takes on a little different meaning, I think. It makes it a little more interesting to hear what's happening, and you understand better what this is building up to, right?
Yeah, there's an urgency on the part of Jesus because he knows his time is very near. And he's agitated.
He's very agitated, and that was evident in what he did in the temple, right? His actions in the temple on Monday. And again, we say that, you know, what I'll tell you what was really strange this week or last week was doing this class on Wednesday, talking about Mark's story of Jesus's actions in the temple. And remember, Borg and Crossan don't like the term cleansing of the temple. And then having to preach on John's version of the story on Sunday. There was a little, and for me, I had to keep going back and forth and checking, wait a minute, is that John that said that, or was that Mark that said that? And it's a little different, isn't it? I mean, more or less, it's kind of the same story, but you know, when you read these gospels over and over and over and over, and you talk about them, you begin to understand those nuances of each evangelist and why they say the things they do and why it's pertinent to their community and why it's important in that time, right? And Mark, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, most likely they're hearing this and reading this after the temple's already been destroyed, or in that time when the temple was being destroyed, right? Which was 70 AD. So it's pertinent that we're hearing about destruction of the temple when they probably saw it actually happen, or were around when it actually happened, whether they might have been in the northern. Mark's community is thought of to be up around Galilee. So they'd be about 100 miles outside of Jerusalem, but they would have been aware of what's going on in Jerusalem because the Roman armies would have been in Galilee too. They would have been in all of Israel, right?
So do you think it's before or after? Because I know I've read that some scholars can't quite figure out whether this is, you know, foretelling it or reporting on it, like whether it was written in maybe 68 or maybe it was written in 72. Do you think it was written after that?
That's really hard to say, but I think it is written around the time that the war is happening. So from a historical point, the war, Rome came back in about 63, and the war really started around 66. That's when that it started to really ramp up. And the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem doesn't happen until 70, but the war's been going on for 4 years, and the occupation's been going on for 7 years, right?
Right.
And then the dust settling for however many years afterwards, I don't know. So it was definitely written at a time when frustration level was high. They were already occupied for sure. So even if it were written in, I've heard as early as 65, even if it were written in 65, Rome's already there. They're already occupying. They're already starting this process that just hasn't begun yet. So in Mark writing it, I mean, I think Mark understands what's most likely going to happen. And no, he had no way to know that the temple might be destroyed, but certainly those who are reading this after 70 are going to read that into it, right? So it's hard to get an exact date. They're definitely it's definitely written in occupied times. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Was he in Rome when he wrote? I've read that he was perhaps in Rome when he wrote it, or part of it, or.
I just read today something saying that they thought Mark's community was mostly north. It was mostly in the Galilee area, but certainly Mark's home would have been Rome, or not Rome, would have been Jerusalem.
Right.
But you think Mark was in Rome when he wrote this?
Or maybe it was, I guess it could have been, if Rome occupied everything, I guess everything was Rome then, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't know a history of him being outside of Israel.
Yeah.
To write this, but he certainly, if we believe the writer to be John Mark of the Gospels, then he would have been from Jerusalem.
Right.
It's hard to tell. That's the thing when we study these things. Yes, we know a lot more than we used to about these communities and where they're from, but we certainly don't know everything and haven't unearthed things that have told us that. So, and in this case, it's simply it is important to know that, but at the same time, it's important to understand the message Mark's trying to get across.
Right. We'll never know the specifics. I mean, there's St. Mark the Evangelist, there's John Mark. Maybe they were the same person. Maybe they weren't. Who knows? Right. Nobody knows. No.
So Jesus moves into the temple. And now we get a bunch of stories and teachings, again, that I said we've been hearing in the lectionary cycle. So we get the challenge from the religious authority about Jesus's authority, right? By what authority do you do these things? Then Jesus will tell a parable that's pretty prickly. Then we get a string of challenges in a row from different groups coming at him. It's like they're standing in line waiting to get to him. We get a brief intermission. There's some goodness that happens. Then it goes back to the conflict and the challenges. And then Jesus takes a turn to initiate a question. And then we move into what we call the end of the public ministry in Jerusalem and what we call the Farewell Discourse. And Mark's chapter 13, which is known as the Little Apocalypse, which is how he ends that section. So that's where Tuesday goes. So let's look at the stories. By what authority? So Jesus comes into the temple, and this is starting at 11:27. As he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, and that's the pretty standard, typical group we hear of, right? The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. That pretty much puts out there all of the religious authority. And then we're going to get later the groups. There's the Pharisees, and then we'll get the Sadducees, right? Chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" Jesus turns it on them, doesn't he? "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they can't answer. And remember why they can't answer?
Because the crowd will take them down if they do.
If they answer a certain way. But if they answer the other way,
then he'll be proven wrong.
Well, yeah, and they'll be considered hypocrites. So they're trapped. They come to trap Jesus, and Jesus traps them, right? Brilliant in his riposte. And they can't answer. And rightly so, they don't answer. And Jesus says, and they're afraid of the crowds. And Jesus says, then I'm not going to tell you by whose authority I'm here. And he makes them look like fools. And that's not the first time that's going to happen, is it?
No.
So then we get to the parable. And Jesus, without missing a beat, or in my mind, without missing a beat, goes straight into it. Then he began to speak to them in parables, but we only hear the one parable. And it's what we tend to call the parable of the wicked tenants. And Borg and Crossan would suggest it would be better called the greedy tenants. And then another source I'm using, the Chris Bryan source, refers to it in his good old school English term, the parable of the what does he say? The husband. I can't even. Hang on a second.
Husbandman.
Husbandman. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The parable of the wicked husbandmen. The wicked husbandmen.
A tenant or a farmer or something like that.
Yeah. But that's just a very English term, I think. Which would be like Chris to do that. And what does the parable tell us? I remember the parable. What's the basic gist of it?
That the greedy slaves, are they slaves?
No, they're the tenants who are hired to work
tenant, and they kill the son of the owner so as to take control of the property. And then the question is put before the father of the slain son. What would you do? Right? What would you do? Would you then take back the farm, kill all the tenants? What are you going to do? And that's when Jesus steps in with the cornerstone talk.
And allegorically, what does the vineyard represent? Remember?
No.
So it harkens back to Isaiah, and there's the story of the vineyard in Isaiah. So the vineyard is Israel, and the owner of the vineyard is God. And I think that part is pretty straightforward in it. Where it gets a little sticky is the beloved son necessarily Jesus?
Why would it not be?
Well, I think in post-resurrection Christian church terms, yes, we all see that. But I think the point more, and I'm going to read some things that talk about this. I think the point more from Jesus saying this is not so much that that Mark's listeners equate that beloved son with Jesus as much as it's the condemnation on the religious authorities being the wicked tenants. Of course, Jesus knows what's going to happen. Nobody else does. So in a sense, yes, it is going to be Jesus, but the crowd is not, the crowd with Jesus at that time is not going to understand that to be him, right? It's more for Jesus to say, to indict the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. So I have a note here that says Mark's main reason for adding this is not Christological, but is evidenced by the final part where the religious authorities realize Jesus is talking about them. They want to arrest him, but again, fear the crowds. And so let me give you a bit again out of Crossan and Borg about that. Commonly called the parable of the wicked tenants, this story might better be called the parable of the greedy tenants. Of course, they are wicked, they kill people, but the motivation for their murderous behavior is greed. They want to possess the produce of the vineyard for themselves. As many of the parables of Jesus do, the story concludes with an invitation to its hearers to make a judgment about what they have just heard. Jesus asks, "What then will the owner of the vineyard do?" Jesus supplies the obvious answer. He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Christian interpretation of this parable has most often emphasized a Christological meaning, as if its purpose is to proclaim that Jesus is the beloved Son sent by the vineyard owner, who symbolizes God. Much scholarly endeavor has been expended on this issue. Some scholars argue that the parable goes back to Jesus and is thus evidence that the historical Jesus saw himself as the beloved Son of God. Other scholars argue that Jesus did not make such a claim for himself and thus suspect that the parable is a post-Easter creation by the early Christian movement. And thus suspect that the parable is a post-Easter creation by the early Christian movement. We do not need to enter into this debate, for our focus is on what the parable means as part of Mark's story of Jesus's final week. Although for the author of Mark, Jesus is of course the Son of God, the primary meaning of the parable is not Christological. Rather, as Mark tells us at the very end of the story, it is an indictment of the authorities. They realized that he had told this parable against them. They refers to the chief priests, elders, and scribes of the previous episode, those at the top of the local domination system. They are the greedy and murderous tenants who rejected and killed the servants and son sent by the owner of the vineyard. So they basically said, let's not get into a debate about the historical Jesus or whether Jesus thinks this or not. Let's just look at what he gets at the end, and that is indicting the religious leaders. That's the main point of, in Mark's sense, for having this parable occur here. And so moving forward, any other thoughts on that?
I was just looking back at Isaiah. Is that chapter 5?
I believe it is. That's, I expected you to yield grapes, but you yielded wild grapes.
The song of the unfruitful vineyard.
Yep. And of course, there it's also an allegory for Israel.
Right. Yeah.
So let me give you a take. So moving forward now, with this parable sort of laying the basis, and we have to keep this parable in mind as we move forward into the next things that are going to happen to Jesus in the temple. We have to keep this parable in mind. So what Chris Bryan says here, and bear with me. So the parable ends, and Mark tells us again of the authorities' hostility toward Jesus. They seek to arrest him. One thing restrains them. They feared the multitude. Once more, the ever-present crowd, The crowd has been a source of pressure upon Jesus in the past. Now it seems to be his protection and will be significant in what is to come. For the moment, Jesus' enemies withdraw, but they do not thereby cease their hostility. On the contrary, they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to entrap him in his talk. The pious Pharisees and the worldly Herodians. It is precisely the curious and unlikely combination of which we last heard in chapter 3. Thus reminded, we do not need to be told their object, for we already know it. It is to destroy Jesus. In pointing us back, Mark has again pointed us forward. He has also, in the short term, provided himself with an ideal hook, whereby he may lead us directly to the next part of his narrative. The 4 questions that will be put in turn by Pharisees, Sadducees, the good scribe, and Jesus himself. The section appears to contain both a linear and a concentric development. Beginning with the subtle attempt of the Pharisees and Herodians to ensnare Jesus, we move through the cruder hostility of the Sadducees to the friendship of the scribe, to the final teaching in which none dared to ask him any question, although the great throng heard him gladly. I think that's a great phrase. The religious leaders didn't dare to ask him any questions, and the crowd thought it was great. In other words, while the section is certainly overshadowed by the opposition of the religious establishment to Jesus, with which it begins, yet in its linear development, emphasis is not only on that opposition, but also on Jesus's triumph over it and his successful vindication of himself at every point, which really is what he does. People will say Jesus was a skilled debater. And I'm like, well, if Jesus is God, then he's pretty much skilled at just about anything, isn't he? I mean, yeah, he's a skilled debater. He's good at everything. So remember what the first challenge is. We get the Pharisees who come up. Then they sent to him some Pharisees and some Herodians to trap him in what he said. And they came and said to him, and this is about taxes to Caesar or to the emperor. So that's sort of the first question that gets posed. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? So when Chris talked about the 4 questions, that's the first one. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? And of course, we all remember what Jesus said. And when you think of this story, let me ask you this question. When you think of this story about paying taxes to the emperor, if somebody said to you, well, tell me about that story. What's the part that probably jumps out to you the most in that story?
Jesus' final quote about render to Caesar what is Caesar's,
and to God what is God's.
And to God what is God.
And I agree. That's probably the one part of it that we all remember the most and take away and we recall. But I think the more important part of the story, and certainly what they want us to know, and I think what Mark wants us to know, Mark wants his readers to know, is not as much that as it is the fact that Jesus said, bring me a coin and let me see it. And they do. And then Jesus continues, whose head and whose title on it. But it's the fact that the scandalous part is that they actually have a coin on them and can produce it and show it to him.
Yeah.
To me, that's the bigger part, and to Borg and Crossan too, because that shows to Mark's readers or listeners of the story that, oh, they're somewhat hypocritical because they're telling us we can't pay temple tax with these coins. We can't be anywhere near the temple with these coins. We got to change it out. And yet they've got them.
Yeah, the visual of a Pharisee or a scribe reaching into his pocket and pulling out the denarii is pretty indicting.
It is. It's very indicting, and it's very telling of the greed that Jesus just spoke about in the parable of the wicked tenants, isn't it? So,
Oh, you mean this denarii?
yeah.
Oh,
Oh, and why do you have that? Well, because I'm milking you for all you're worth. So that really becomes the scandalous part of that story. But so what Jesus says is just kind of icing on the cake. You know, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. But here's something that I find really interesting. I don't want to keep reading from this book, but it's great the way they put it. The spokesman of the authorities set the trap skillfully. Either answer would get Jesus in trouble. If Jesus were to answer no, he would be charged with advocating denial of Roman authority. In short, with sedition. If he were to answer yes, he risked discrediting himself with the crowd, who for both economic and religious reasons resented Roman rule and taxation. Most likely, this was the primary purpose of the question, to separate Jesus from the crowd by leading him into an unpopular response. So remember, the crowd is on his side at this point. Jesus' response is masterful. As he did in the question about authority, he turns the situation back on his opponents. He sets a counter trap when he asks to see a denarius. Denarius was a silver coin equal to approximately a day's wage. His interrogators produce one. Jesus looks at it and then asks, whose head is this and whose title? Or in the words of an older translation, whose image and inscription on this? We all know their answer, the emperor's. Jesus' strategy has led his questioners to disclose to the crowd that they have a coin with Caesar's image on it. In this moment, they are discredited. Why? In the Jewish homeland in the first century, there were two types of coins. One type, because of the Jewish prohibition of graven images, had no human or animal images. The second type, including Roman coinage, had images. Many Jews would not carry or use coins of the second type. But Jesus' interrogators in the story did. The coin they produced had Caesar's image along with the standard and idolatrous inscription heralding Caesar as divine and son of God. They are exposed as part of the politics of collaboration. Jesus' rhetorical strategy is brilliant. Their trap has been evaded, his own counter-trap set and sprung. Thus, even before the famous words about rendering to Caesar, Jesus has won the encounter. And this, I find this very interesting. The land of Israel belongs to God. Recall Leviticus 25, chapter 25, verse 23, which says that all are tenant farmers or resident aliens on land that belongs to God. To use Tuesday's language, the vineyard belongs to God, not to the local collaborators, not to Rome. Indeed, the whole earth belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. What belongs to Caesar? The implication is nothing. That takes all the wind out of their sails, doesn't it? So give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, but what he's implying is it's all God's.
well, and as Paul would say, God instituted government. I mean, it was all created by God, right? Doesn't Paul speak to that in one of his letters about how
he does? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
It's another way of saying that.
You just have to wonder. I wonder what the look on their faces would have been when he said that.
Well, it says the last line is, and they were utterly amazed at him.
Yeah. And then again, the crowds are loving it. Ooh, we got him again. And you wonder, Jesus traps them so easily, at least the way Mark writes it when he says, show me a denarius. And they just so nonchalantly pull one out. And you wonder if any of them are going, oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And yet they did.
Well, and this is kind of a nuance to that same point, but Jesus is showing everyone present that, and knowing that within a few days, he would be crucified by the same government that he's telling everybody to pay their taxes to. And by saying that, he's saying what is worldly, what is earthly is not important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Taxes, government, authority, none of that is important. And Jesus is going to prove that in 3 or 4 days.
And the crowd that right now is cheering Jesus and is with Jesus is going to suddenly turn against him.
Right. Oh, yeah.
But for now, for Tuesday, he still has the crowd.
The crowds are always amazed, but they never quite fully understand and then turn against them. Or the Pharisees throughout here are portrayed as being jealous and fearful in their own way. I mean, earlier they talk about being fearful of the crowd, and now they're amazed at his abilities to get out of the situation, which is kind of a form of fear. So it's just consistent with Mark's. Every group is fearful in some way throughout this entire gospel.
So the Pharisees and the Herodians don't get anywhere. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders didn't get anywhere. Pharisees and Herodians don't get anywhere. So the line moves up. They go to the back of the line. The next group comes up, and we have the Sadducees.
Who's next?
And they question Jesus. And they hit Jesus with several things, don't they? And we're told that here come the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. So there's going to be a question about that. And then there's going to be a question about the law in terms of marriage. And then there's going to be the question of God's position. Well, no, it's not so much questions. What Jesus says back to them, his response. The question really is about marriage, right? That's the question. So that's your second of the 4 questions is when this woman dies after having been married to the 7 brothers, whose wife will she be in heaven? Which, first of all, we don't believe that that's going to happen, that there isn't going to be a resurrection. But if there were, whose wife would she be? And Jesus, remember, has a great comeback. His answer, his response is threefold. He first of all gives the broad indictment of the Sadducees, telling them they don't know Scripture or the power of God. And I think that's what's so funny to me. Jesus says, "Is not this the reason you are wrong, that you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God?" I would think they would be taken aback by that. They're not expecting that. So he indicts them on that, and then he addresses the marriage question, or levirate marriage, and how in the resurrection there will be no marriage. And then he addresses that, again, to the resurrection, God is God of the living, not of the dead. And to understand the Sadducees a little more.
And this is the wealthy class that they would be concerned with all of these things about maintaining their position.
Yes.
And
Sadducees,
the nobility in league with the priests.
Right. The Sadducees were part of the aristocracy, wealthy and powerful. They included high priestly families as well as lay nobility. As a group, they overlap but are not identical to the chief priests, elders, and scribes. Their religious convictions differed in 2 significant ways from those of most of their Jewish contemporaries. First, they accepted only the law, that is, the first 5 books of Moses, the Torah or the Pentateuch, as sacred scripture. Most Jews also accept the prophets as sacred, but the Sadducees do not. And their non-acceptance of the prophets reflected their position in society. For the books of the prophets emphasize God's justice over against the human injustice of social systems dominated by the wealthy and powerful. So they don't accept the prophets because the prophets make them look bad. Or the prophets speak to them, for the most part, condemn them. And they're like, oh, we don't have to believe them. We just believe the law, right? But it still seems like that they only believe the law, but they still tend to interpret the law to their advantage.
Because the law maintains structure.
Right. And so here's this question of levirate marriage, right? I mean, that was a legitimate thing that happened. That you would raise, if your brother was married and your brother died and didn't have any descendants, and you're the next brother in line, you would marry his wife, and if you have children, you would raise them as your brother's offspring. And yet none of them have children in this story that absolutely sounds ridiculous. But Jesus says something funny. Go ahead.
This story reminds me, I mean, this is going to sound really odd, but this convoluted thing reminds me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail asking about the unladen swallow at the bridge, you know? I mean, just the kind of, going through all this and then just shutting him down. So anyway, that's
what he says. He says, what kind of swallow? African?
What do you mean?
Yeah.
Or European, yeah. What's the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? What do you mean? African or European swallow? Yeah. So that's what this reminds me of. But anyway, I'll be quiet now.
So, Borg and Crossan point out something interesting Jesus says, which they say is really unclear. No one really knows why he said this or what to make of it. So Jesus says in his response about marriage, for when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And Borg and Crossan are saying it's unclear to us what to make of this response. Is it intended by Jesus or Mark as an informative statement about the afterlife, namely that there will be no marriage there, for we will be, quote, like angels? If so, what does this mean? What does it mean to be like angels? And how does this connect to absence of marriage? Is the life of the age to come sexless, perhaps even genderless? Or does being, quote, like angels mean that procreation and property, the primary purposes of patriarchal and levirate marriage, are irrelevant there? Or does it mean even more, namely that conditions in the resurrected life will be radically different from what life is like on earth? And how radical is the discontinuity? Will we still be, quote, us? Or is it the attempt to discern an informative meaning basically a mistake? Is Jesus's response, as in some of the previous stories, intended primarily as a skillful evasion of a question intended to entrap him? It is perhaps intended not to inform, but to confound. And I think that my personal thought is the use of angels is something that the Sadducees could probably understand. And Jesus is now putting us in the resurrection on a level with the angels, not trying to say that we become angels, but we're like angels in the sense that we dwell in the same realm as the angels do, right?
And the angels would have no concern for those worldly things.
No. And the angels would have been part of the Pentateuch. The angels appear in Torah. So that's something that Jesus plays into their acknowledging the law and that angels exist in that law. But to put humans in the same realm as angels would have completely thrown them for a loop. That's where I think that's coming from. If that makes any sense.
I think several of those reasons work.
Hey, take your pick.
Yeah, I think any of the last 3 or 4 make sense.
So then we get a little break in the action. All right, so now the Sadducees are done. We're Well, let me just briefly talk about the God is God of not the dead, but the living, when he says at the burning bush, which is in Exodus, which is in the Pentateuch, that when God tells Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, that, he is the God not of the dead, but of the living, which would then suggest that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive somewhere. And if there's no resurrection, then how could they still be around, and why is Jesus talking about them? But remember, the transfiguration, we see Jesus talking to Moses and Elijah. And I don't think he just created, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Oh, when you project the image of somebody.
A hologram.
They're not just holograms. They were living, breathing people standing there talking with him. I'm stuck in Old Testament things. I can't think that far in the future to come up with hologram. And of course, that is going to throw them for a loop too. So the Sadducees are utterly defeated. They move out of line. They go to the back of the line, and up comes a scribe. But he's called the, quote, good scribe, because he doesn't challenge Jesus. So conflict goes away, and we see a relationship form between Jesus and the one asking the question, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus, apparently, according to the scribe, answers correctly. And the scribe is happy and moves on, right? I don't think there's a whole lot to go into there, other than why does Mark give us a break? Borg and Crossan say, for the first and only time in this section of Mark, the theme of conflict disappears. For the first and only time.
It's like Nourishment Sunday, Andy.
Mothering Sunday, yeah.
And why from a scribe? Because, like throughout, when Mark talks about groups, Pharisees and scribes are usually lumped together, and they're always portrayed negatively when they're grouped together. So it's kind of interesting that he would, be favorable about it. It could be because in the first line is, one of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked him. So maybe it's just that the scribe was persuaded from or impressed by the prior answer. But it seems odd that he would have a positive portrayal of a scribe.
Well, maybe Mark had a buddy who was a scribe.
That could be. This was his pal Dave or something.
Yeah. Borg and Crossan say, in the midst of this series of conflict stories, we are reminded that not all scribes were opposed to Jesus, just as not all Pharisees and aristocrats were. Later in Mark's gospel, Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the council, arranges for the burial of Jesus. And in John's gospel, Nicodemus is a Pharisee who's favorable to Jesus. So, it just goes to show there are some good people mixed in with the group that mostly is not good.
There were even some centurions that got along with it.
Even some centurions eventually.
Although four lines later he said, beware of the scribes.
Well, he does.
Yeah.
He does. He will, because for the most part, they aren't very nice. But we aren't going to get to that, unfortunately, because I think it's 8 o'clock. So here's what will happen as we trudge slowly on. We've got to pick up where we're leaving off, the next section, where Jesus will then ask the question. He turns around and he's the one who initiates the question. Why is the Messiah called the Son of David, right? Conflict comes back in, and then we have sort of that, the scribe bit that you're talking about, Mark, is a transition piece. Beware the scribes, and then we hear the story of the widow's mite, is all in transition to go to then the little apocalypse. Called little apocalypse because the big apocalypse is the book of Revelation. So this is just the little apocalypse, which will then lead us into Wednesday. So we'll pick up there next week. The last bit of Tuesday is Jesus will move out of the temple, and then we should be able to cover Wednesday pretty easily maybe get into Thursday, so that on our last day we can at least get to the crucifixion. We're trying to get to the cross. We may not quite get there, but we hope. I hope we do get there.